Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I remember the way the room smelled before anything went wrong. Fresh flowers, white roses, and eucalyptus mixed with the sharp sweetness of champagne. Linen tablecloths brushed against my knees as I shifted in my chair, smoothing the crease in my dress for the 10th time, the way mothers do when their nerves are pretending to be excitement. The hall glittered with soft lights strung like stars, and my daughter, Mara, stood at the front in a gown that looked like it had been sewn out of morning light. She was smiling, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and settles there, confident and calm. I told myself that smile meant I had worried too much. I told myself I could finally let go. I had spent years learning how to do that, letting go, learning to tell myself that my instincts were old-fashioned, that my concerns were the leftovers of my own bad marriage, that not every man who liked control was cruel. Some people just liked order, I'd said. Some people just needed reassurance. Some people loved deeply and showed it awkwardly. I'd practiced those excuses in the mirror so often they sounded like facts. Mara's fiancé, Evan, stood beside her, tall and polished, his hair parted with careful precision, his suit tailored to a confidence that never wrinkled. He had a smile that photographers adored because it looked effortless. I knew better. I'd seen him rehearse that smile in the reflection of our hallway mirror when he thought no one was watching. Lift the corners, soften the eyes, breathe, perform. The ceremony itself passed like a gentle tide, vows spoken, rings exchanged, applause swelling and falling. When they kissed, the room erupted, and I stood with everyone else, clapping until my palms stung, tears blurring the edges of my vision. I cried because my daughter looked happy. I cried because I wanted that happiness to last. I cried because I knew, deep down, that moments don't last just because we beg them to. At the reception, as plates were cleared and glasses refilled, I tried to enjoy myself. I laughed at the right times. I hugged relatives I hadn't seen in years. I told Mara she looked beautiful again and again until she squeezed my hands and said, "Mom, I know." Her voice was warm, grateful, trusting. That trust settled on my shoulders like a weight I had been carrying since the day Evan first shook my hand. I remembered that day vividly. He had come to dinner with a bouquet too large for the small apartment we lived in then. Roses again. Always roses. He spoke politely, asked about my work, complimented my cooking. He looked at Mara as if she were something precious and fragile. When he corrected her gently, "No, you mean Tuesday, not Thursday," I told myself it was nothing. When he ordered for her at restaurants, I told myself it was chivalry. When he teased her about being forgetful, about being sensitive, about needing him to keep her grounded, I told myself love was allowed to have jokes. The toasts began after dessert. Best man, maid of honor, laughter, tears, stories softened by time and affection. I felt my shoulders relax inch by inch, like a long-held breath finally leaving my body. Then Evan stood up. He tapped his glass lightly, smiling as the room hushed. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked his parents, thanked mine. He spoke about fate, about meeting Mara, about how she'd changed his life. His voice was smooth, practiced, carrying easily to the far corners of the hall. I watched my daughter's face as he spoke. She glowed under his attention, proud and a little shy, the way she'd been as a child when praised in public. Then he laughed, a short, charming sound. Of course, no one's perfect. The room chuckled softly. Mara has her little flaws, don't we all? More laughter. I felt something tighten in my chest. "But I promise you," he continued, lifting his glass toward her, "I'll spend the rest of my life fixing them." The laughter grew louder. Applause followed. People nodded, smiling, some murmuring how sweet it was. I didn't hear any of that clearly. The words echoed instead, repeating themselves with a sharpness that cut through the music and the chatter and the clinking glasses. Fixing them, fixing her flaws. I looked at Mara. Her smile had faltered just for a second, a flicker. She laughed because everyone else was laughing, because that's what you do when you're on a stage and the script moves faster than your feelings. I saw her glance at Evan, searching his face, then nod as if agreeing to a joke she hadn't found funny. My hands were trembling. I pressed them together in my lap, nails digging into skin. In that moment, the years I had spent swallowing my doubts rushed back with a force that stole my breath. Memories I had packed away, labeled dangerous, surged forward, demanding to be seen. I remembered the night Mara called me crying because Evan had read her messages and accused her of hiding things. He had said he just wanted honesty. I remembered the way he'd insisted she stop seeing a friend who was a bad influence, the way he framed it as concern. I remembered the time she showed up with a bruise on her arm and laughed it off as clumsiness, and I had laughed with her, relief drowning out reason. And then there was the secret, the one that I had helped bury, the one that sat between my ribs now, heavy and alive. It had happened 2 years earlier, before the engagement, before the ring and the venue and the invitations. Mara had come to me late one night, shaking, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She told me Evan had lost his temper during an argument. She told me he hadn't meant to hurt her. She told me she loved him. She begged me not to tell anyone. She said it would ruin everything. She said he was sorry. He had cried. He had promised to change. I had seen the mark on her wrist, the unmistakable outline of fingers pressed too hard. I had felt a cold clarity then, a certainty that made my knees weak. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to drag her away from him and lock the door. But she was an adult. She was in love, and I was a mother who remembered how it felt to be young and stubborn and convinced that no one else could understand. Evan had come to see me the next day. He had sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes red. He apologized. He spoke about stress, about fear of losing Mara, about therapy and anger management, and growth. He said the word mistake so many times it began to sound harmless. He asked me to help him protect Mara from gossip, from judgment. He asked me to help him fix things. I agreed to keep quiet. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was protecting my daughter's happiness. I didn't realize then that silence doesn't stay silent. It grows. It learns to breathe. Now, sitting in that beautiful hall, applause still ringing in my ears, I felt the full weight of what I had done. Evan's joke wasn't a joke. It was a promise, one he believed he had the right to keep. He raised his glass again, and I watched my daughter lift hers, her smile carefully arranged. Something inside me broke open, not with a sound, but with a resolve that felt terrifyingly calm. I understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that if I said nothing now, I would be complicit forever. I would be choosing the performance over the person I had brought into this world. I looked around the room at faces filled with joy, unaware of the storm gathering quietly at the edge of the dance floor. I felt the years press against my back, every choice that had led to this moment lining up behind me like witnesses. When the clapping finally died down, I realized my heart had stopped racing. In its place was a steady, determined beat. I knew what I had to do. I didn't know how the room would react. I didn't know if Mara would forgive me. I only knew that the word fix would haunt me if I let it pass. I reached for my purse and felt the folded paper inside, edges worn soft from being handled so many times. Proof, the thing I had sworn never to bring into the light. My breath came slow and deep as I stood, the legs of my chair scraping softly against the floor. All eyes turned toward me, And in that silence, I understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Love that demands fixing is not love at all, and a mother's silence can be the most dangerous lie she ever tells. I could feel the room watching me as I stood there, the soft music fading into an awkward hush. My throat tightened, but I didn't sit back down. I had learned something about fear over the years. If you let it choose the moment, it will always choose too late. So I held my purse against my side, fingers curled around the folded paper inside, and I looked straight at my daughter. Mara's eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across her face. She smiled at me, the same smile she'd worn when she was 5 and nervous about a school recital, the same one that silently asked, "Is everything okay?" I swallowed hard. This wasn't how mothers were supposed to speak at weddings. We were supposed to tell sweet stories, embarrass them gently, bless the future, and sit back down. I had practiced that speech in my head for months. This wasn't it. "I didn't plan to speak," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. But something was said just now that I can't ignore. A ripple moved through the crowd, a shifting of bodies, curiosity sharpening into attention. Evan's smile stiffened. He watched me carefully, his eyes calculating in a way I recognized too well. "I've spent most of my life believing that love means compromise, that it means patience, that it means overlooking flaws for the sake of peace." I paused, letting the words settle. But I've learned there's a difference between overlooking flaws and erasing someone. A murmur spread across the tables. Evan cleared his throat softly, still smiling, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Mara's hand trembled slightly where it rested against her dress. I forced myself to keep going, to stay with the truth even as it burned. 2 years ago, I said, my daughter came to me late at night. She was crying, she was afraid, and she asked me to keep a secret. My hands shook, but I didn't stop. I agreed. I thought I was protecting her. I thought silence was kindness. Gasps broke out around the room. Evan's face had gone pale, the smile gone entirely now. He shook his head slightly, a warning disguised as disbelief. "This isn't appropriate. We can talk about this later." "No," I replied quietly. "We can't." I reached into my purse and unfolded the paper. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just ink, but time itself. "This," I said, holding it up, "is a report, filed and withdrawn, a record of an incident that was explained away as a mistake." My voice cracked then just for a second. "An incident where fixing went too far." Mara's face drained of color. She stared at the paper, then at Evan, her mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. I saw the moment recognition hit her, the memory she had tried so hard to reshape into something harmless. Her knees seemed to buckle, and someone behind her steadied her without thinking. Evan stepped forward. "You promised," he hissed under his breath, the charm stripped away. "You said you wouldn't." I met his gaze, every ounce of fear replaced by a fierce clarity. "I promised to protect my daughter, and I failed once. I won't fail again." The room erupted then, not with applause, but with voices, shock, anger, confusion. Evan's parents stood abruptly, his mother's hand flying to her mouth. Someone called my name. Someone else whispered. Through it all, Mara stood frozen, caught between the life she had imagined and the truth now unraveling it thread by thread. "I'm not doing this to humiliate anyone," I raised my voice just enough to be heard. "I'm doing this because love should never hurt, and because control dressed up as devotion is still control." Mara looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the child she had been and the woman she was trying to become collide in her eyes. "Is it true?" she asked Evan, her voice barely audible. He reached for her instinctively, as if to steady her, to pull her back into alignment. She flinched. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And I saw something change in her posture, a subtle straightening, a reclaiming of space. "I said I was sorry," he replied, his voice sharp now. "I said it would never happen again. Why are you doing this? Why are you letting her ruin everything?" The word ruin hung in the air, heavy and telling. Mara's hand dropped to her side. "You said you were fixing me," she said quietly. "You said you made me angry, that if I didn't push you, you would lose your control." Silence fell again, deeper this time. Evan looked around, realizing too late that the room was no longer on his side. Masks only work when everyone agrees not to look behind them. Mara turned toward me then, tears filling freely now. "Why didn't you tell me to leave?" she asked. The pain in her voice sliced through me sharper than any accusation could have. "I was afraid," I said, the truth tasting bitter and necessary. "Afraid you'd hate me, afraid I'd be wrong, afraid that if I spoke, I'd lose you." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing not just my words, but the years behind them. Then she took a step back from Evan, another. The distance between them felt vast. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't do this right now." Evan's anger flared openly then. "You're overreacting. You're letting her manipulate you. This is exactly what I was talking about, your flaws." The word landed like a final blow. Mara inhaled sharply, then lifted her chin. "If my flaw is believing I deserve kindness, then I'm not fixing it." She handed him her ring. The sound it made against his palm was soft, almost insignificant, but it echoed louder than the music ever had. People stepped back instinctively, giving her space as she moved toward me. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her shake, feeling the weight of her against my chest, and for the first time in years, I knew I was doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The wedding ended not with a dance, but with a reckoning. Guests left quietly, conversations hushed and eyes wide. Some hugged us, some avoided us. Evan left without another word, his perfect image splintered beyond repair. I watched him go without satisfaction, only a deep, aching relief. Later, when the hall was empty and the lights dimmed, Mara and I sat together on the edge of the stage, her dress pooled around her like a discarded dream. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. "I don't know either, but I know you won't walk it alone." As we sat there, surrounded by the remains of a celebration that had become something else entirely, I understood the lesson I would carry for the rest of my life. Silence can feel like love, but it is not. Love speaks, even when its voice shakes. Especially then. The days after the wedding blurred together in a way I still struggle to describe. Time didn't move forward so much as it folded in on itself. Morning bled into night, sleep came in shallow pieces, and every quiet moment felt louder than the chaos of that reception hall. Mara stayed with me. She didn't say she was afraid to be alone, but she didn't have to. I could hear it in the way she padded down the hallway at night, the way she paused outside my bedroom door before going back to the couch. On the first morning, I made coffee the way I always had, strong and a little bitter. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar and grounding. Mara sat at the table in one of my old sweaters, her hair pulled into a loose knot, her makeup washed away. Without the dress, without the lights and eyes on her, she looked younger, tired, like someone who had just woken up from a long, confusing dream. "I keep thinking my phone is going to buzz," she said quietly, staring into her mug. "Like this is all going to rewind and I'll still be engaged." I nodded. "That feeling takes time to fade." She looked at me then, searching. "How do you know?" Because I had lived it. Because I had married a man who mistook obedience for love and patience for permission. Because I had spent years untangling myself from a version of life that looked fine from the outside and hollow from the inside. But I didn't say all that. Not yet. I've had my own rewinds, I said instead. They get quieter. Evan called that afternoon. I didn't answer. He texted, long messages at first, paragraphs of apologies tangled with blame, then shorter ones, then anger. He said he had stolen something from me. He said I had poisoned Mara against him. He said families should stay out of marriages. Each message felt like confirmation rather than surprise. Control doesn't vanish when it's exposed. It just changes shape. Mara read them with a stillness that frightened me. She didn't cry. She didn't respond. She just handed me the phone when she was done, like someone turning in evidence. I used to think this meant passion, all this intensity. I thought it meant I mattered. It meant he needed you, not that he cherished you. That distinction seemed to settle into her slowly, like sediment in water. Over the next few days, pieces of her relationship surfaced in fragments, little moments she had dismissed, the way he corrected her in front of others, the way he decided what she wore when they went out, the way he told her certain friends didn't really have her best interests at heart. She spoke without drama, without embellishment, as if she were finally allowed to observe her own life objectively. I feel stupid, she admitted one evening as we folded laundry together, like everyone else saw it and I didn't. I stopped folding and looked at her. You're not stupid, I said firmly. You were conditioned. There's a difference. She nodded, biting her lip. Did you see it? I hesitated. Honesty had cost us the illusion of a perfect wedding. It deserved to be complete now. Yes, I said instead. I saw parts of it. And you didn't stop me? The words weren't cruel. They were curious, honest, and they pierced me all the same. I was afraid, I said again. Afraid of losing you. Afraid you'd think I didn't trust you. Afraid of being the villain in your love story. She absorbed that quietly, then surprised me by reaching for my hand. I wish you'd been braver sooner, but I'm glad you were brave when it mattered. Forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in steps. That was one of them. News of the wedding traveled fast. People talked. Some reached out with support, others with thinly veiled judgment. I learned quickly who valued appearances and who valued safety. Evan's parents sent a letter. Not an apology, not an accusation. A careful explanation. They said they were shocked. They said they needed time. They said families were complicated. I read it once and set it aside. Mara started therapy the following week. I drove her to the first appointment, sitting in the car while she went inside, my hands clenched in my lap. When she came out, her eyes were red, but clearer. She said what happened wasn't my fault. I didn't realize how badly I needed to hear that. Neither had I. Hearing it echoed back to me decades after I'd needed the same words felt like a quiet healing I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky fade into dusk, Mara asked me about my own marriage, the one I rarely spoke of, the one that had shaped so many of my fears. "Did he ever say he'd fix you?" she asked. I laughed softly, without humor. Not in those words. He said he'd help me be better, more manageable, easier to love. She leaned her head against my shoulder. Did you believe him? For a long time, I admitted, until I didn't recognize myself anymore. There was a long pause. Cicadas hummed in the trees. I don't want that, she said finally. You won't have it. Not now, not ever again. Evan tried one last time to see her. He showed up unannounced one afternoon, standing at the edge of the driveway like a stranger. I went out to meet him before Mara could. He looked thinner, less polished. His voice cracked when he spoke. "You destroyed my life," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "Your choices did." He shook his head. "She needs me. She won't be okay without me." I held his gaze. "She's already learning she is." He left without another word. I watched his car disappear down the street and felt no triumph, only a sober understanding of how close we had come to something far worse. Weeks passed, then months. Mara moved into her own place, small but bright, filled with plants and books and quiet. She laughed more easily. She slept better. Sometimes she still doubted herself, still questioned her instincts, but now she named those moments instead of hiding them. She was rebuilding trust, not in others, but in herself. One afternoon, she invited me over for dinner. She cooked, burned the garlic bread. We laughed until our sides hurt. As we ate, she looked at me with a softness that felt earned. "Thank you for standing up, even though it ruined everything." I shook my head. "It didn't ruin everything. It ruined a lie." She smiled. "I like the truth better." That night, driving home, I thought about the wedding hall, about the laughter that had followed Evan's words, about how easily harm can be mistaken for humor. I thought about all the mothers sitting in quiet rooms, holding secrets they call love. I wished I could tell them what I had learned before it was almost too late. Love does not fix. It listens. It does not shrink you to make itself comfortable. It grows alongside you. And sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is risk being misunderstood to protect what matters most. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside, letting the stillness settle. I had lost the illusion of a perfect day. In its place, I had gained my daughter's future. And that was a trade I would make again, every single time.
Life has a strange way of settling after a storm. Not back into what it was before, but into something quieter, rearranged, more honest. In the months after the wedding that wasn't, Mara and I learned how to live inside that new arrangement. There were days when the weight of what had happened pressed on us unexpectedly, like humidity before rain, and there were days that felt light enough to surprise us both. Mara started coming back to herself in small, almost unnoticeable ways. She began humming while she cooked. She rearranged furniture just because she could. She stopped apologizing every time she took up space in a conversation. Watching her felt like watching someone stretch after being cramped for too long. Tentative at first, then bolder. But healing is not a straight line. One afternoon, she called me in tears because she'd seen Evan at the grocery store. He hadn't approached her. He hadn't said a word. He just looked at her, and somehow that had been enough to unravel her. "He looked so normal," she said over the phone, "like none of it ever happened, like I imagined everything." "That's how control survives," I told her, "by pretending it was never there." She breathed through it while I stayed on the line. When she calmed, she said something that made my chest tighten. "I'm scared I won't recognize it next time. What if I end up here again, just with a different face?" I chose my words carefully. "You will recognize it," I said, "because now you know what it costs, and you know what it feels like when something inside you goes quiet to keep the peace." She was silent for a moment. Then, "I don't want to be quiet anymore." That sentence became a kind of compass for her. She taped it to her fridge. She said it out loud when she doubted herself. And slowly, the fear that had once guided her choices began to loosen its grip. For me, the aftermath looked different. I found myself revisiting memories I had long considered settled. My own marriage surfaced in dreams, conversations, moments I hadn't invited. I realized that standing up for Mara had reopened a door I'd closed without ever really walking through. One evening, I sat alone with an old photo album spread across my lap. There I was, younger than Mara was now, smiling beside a man who'd promised me stability, guidance, improvement. I remembered how flattered I'd been that someone wanted to shape me, how easily I'd confused attention with care. I understood then why I had stayed silent for so long, not just for Mara, but for myself. Admitting the truth about Evan meant admitting the truth about my own past. It meant acknowledging that love can be learned wrong and unlearned painfully. Mara noticed the shift in me. "You're different," she said one afternoon, lighter. I think I finally stopped pretending I made all the right choices. Turns out, honesty isn't just something you give other people. She smiled at that, and for a moment we were just two women sharing the quiet relief of understanding. Evan faded into the background of our lives. His name came up less often. When it did, it no longer carried the same charge. Mara blocked his number. I returned his parents' letter unopened when another arrived. Closure doesn't always look like resolution. Sometimes it looks like distance. Myra began volunteering at a local community center, helping young women with job applications and resumes. She said it helped her remember her own competence. Watching her guide others, I saw the confidence that had been dimmed begin to shine again. One night, over dinner, she said, "I used to think love was about being chosen. Now I think it's about being safe." I nodded. "And seen." "And heard," she added. "Yes," I said softly, "especially heard." The anniversary of the wedding date passed quietly. No fanfare, no mourning. We spent the day together, walking through a park, leaves crunching underfoot. At one point, Mara stopped and turned to me. "Do you regret it?" she asked, "standing that day?" I didn't hesitate. No. Even though everyone saw? Especially because everyone saw. Abuse thrives in private. Truth doesn't. She took my arm and we walked on in silence, the kind that feels companionable rather than heavy. Later that year, Mara started dating again, slowly, carefully. She told me about a man who asked instead of assumed, who listened more than he spoke, who didn't rush her feelings or frame her boundaries as obstacles. She watched her own reactions closely, checking in with herself in ways she never had before. "I'm not sure where it's going, but I don't feel like I'm disappearing." "That's a good start," I said. As for me, I found myself speaking more openly with friends, sharing the story I had once been too ashamed to tell. I learned how many women had similar stories tucked away behind polite smiles, how many mothers carried guilt disguised as loyalty. One of them said something that stayed with me. "We confuse endurance with virtue." I thought of Mara's wedding dress folded carefully in a box, of the way she'd stepped out of a future that looked perfect on paper and hollow in practice. Endurance is only virtuous when it's not demanded at the expense of oneself. Months turned into a year. The sharp edges of that day softened, but the lesson remained. Mara flourished in ways that had nothing to do with marriage or milestones. She took a solo trip. She applied for a promotion. She laughed loudly, unapologetically. One afternoon, she hugged me tightly before leaving my house. "Thank you for teaching me what love shouldn't look like," she said. I held her a little longer than necessary. "Thank you for teaching me what courage can do," I replied. After she left, I sat in the quiet of my living room, sunlight slanting across the floor, and thought about the words that had started it all. Fix her flaws. I understood now how dangerous those words were, how easily they slipped past laughter and clinking glasses. People are not projects. Love is not a renovation. And silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can be its own kind of harm. If there is a moral to my story, it's this. When something inside you whispers that a line has been crossed, listen, speak, even if your voice shakes, especially then, because one moment of truth can change the direction of an entire life. And it did. Time did what it always does. It moved forward whether we felt ready or not. The quiet that followed the chaos slowly became familiar, then comfortable. But comfort has a way of revealing what we've buried. And for me, the space left behind by that wedding confrontation became a mirror I couldn't avoid. I started noticing how often I'd spent my life adjusting myself to keep others calm, how many times I'd smoothed tension before it could grow teeth. Standing up for Mara had cracked something open, and now everything I'd swallowed over the years was rising, asking to be acknowledged. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old letter from my ex-husband. It was dated years after our divorce, written during a brief attempt at reconciliation that never truly took. He'd apologized in that familiar, careful way, taking responsibility without naming harm. I sat on the floor reading it, realizing how easily I'd once accepted that kind of apology as enough. Mara noticed my mood that evening. "You okay?" she asked, handing me a cup of tea. "I think I'm finally understanding something," I said. "I thought leaving was the hardest part, but it turns out staying silent afterward was harder." She nodded slowly. "Silence feels safer, until it isn't." Exactly. Silence lets us survive, but it rarely lets us heal. That realization changed how I showed up in the world. I started correcting people when they crossed the lines instead of laughing it off. I stopped excusing behavior that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, but it felt like reclaiming ground I hadn't realized I'd given up. Mara watched this shift with quiet pride. "You're different with people now," she said once. "More present." "I learned from you," I replied honestly, "from watching you choose yourself." Her journey continued too, not without setbacks. There were days when old doubts crept back in, days when she questioned whether she'd been too harsh, too reactive, too much. Those were the days Evan's voice still echoed in her head, disguised as her own. On one of those days, she showed up at my door unannounced. "Tell me again why I left," she said, sitting heavily on the couch. So I did. I reminded her of the wrist mark, of the way he'd framed his anger as her responsibility, of the way her world had shrunk without her noticing. I watched her shoulders relax as memory replaced distortion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed reality, not nostalgia." Reality became our anchor. We spoke of things plainly, without cushioning them in excuses. That honesty, once frightening, became a source of strength. Mara's relationship with her father shifted too. He had been absent from the wedding drama, living in another state, removed from the daily details. When he called after hearing fragments of the story, his response was cautious, almost distant. He asked if Mara was okay, but he didn't ask why things had fallen apart. "She's strong," he told me later. "She'll bounce back." The word bounce unsettled me. Trauma doesn't bounce, it imprints, it shapes. I encouraged Mara to tell her story to him in her own time. When she did, she said it felt like releasing a breath she'd been holding for years. He listened. Awkwardly, imperfectly, but he listened. Sometimes that's where healing begins. One evening, months later, Mara and I attended a small gathering at a friend's house. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation. At one point, someone joked about relationships, about how men like to train their partners. The word landed hard. Mara spoke up before I could. "That's not love," she said calmly. "That's control." The room went quiet, then thoughtful. Conversation shifted. Later, as we drove home, she smiled to herself. "I didn't freeze," she said. "I didn't laugh it off." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you." She squeezed back. "I'm proud of us." As the years of my own marriage finally loosened their grip, I began to see how generational silence works, how mothers teach daughters endurance without realizing it, how we pass down survival strategies long after they stop serving us. Breaking that cycle required more than one brave moment. It required daily choices. Mara made those choices. So did I. She eventually ended the relationship she'd cautiously begun, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't right. She said, "I'm learning the difference between settling and choosing." That kind of discernment felt like victory. One afternoon, we sorted through the last of the wedding items stored in my closet. Invitations, decorations, The dress. Mara held the fabric gently, then folded it away without sadness. It was never about the dress or the day, she said. No, it was about the life after. I agreed. It was about the life after. She donated the dress a week later, said she wanted it to belong to someone starting from a place of freedom. I thought about that often, about how courage doesn't erase loss, but it does transform it. The wedding that never was had become something else, a turning point, a line drawn, a story we would tell not with shame, but with clarity. Sometimes people still ask about it. They lower their voices, lean in, hungry for drama. I don't indulge them. I tell the truth without spectacle. My daughter chose herself, I say, and I chose to stand with her. That's all there is to it. In quieter moments, when I reflect on that day, I no longer feel the sting of embarrassment or the ache of regret. I feel gratitude for the instinct I finally trusted, for the courage I found before it was too late, for the understanding that love does not demand fixing. If there's one thing I hope listeners take from my story, it's this. When someone tells you who they are, especially through jokes or casual remarks, believe them. Pay attention to how love makes you feel in your body, not just how it looks on the surface. Because no celebration is worth a lifetime of shrinking, and no mother's voice is too much when it's speaking to save her child. There is a strange quiet that comes after you've told the truth long enough. It's not empty, it's spacious. That's what the months after Mara's recovery began to feel like. Room to breathe, room to notice things we'd ignored when survival took all our attention. I noticed it first in myself, how my shoulders no longer tightened when the phone rang late, how I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened, how I no longer felt the reflexive urge to smooth over discomfort before it had a chance to teach me something. Mara noticed it too. It's like my nervous system finally believes me, she said one afternoon as we walked along the river path near her apartment. Like it stopped waiting for something bad to happen. That sentence stayed with me. Trauma teaches the body to anticipate harm even when the mind wants peace. Watching her unlearn that, slowly, patiently, was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. She began to talk about the future again, not in rigid plans, but in possibilities. She considered going back to school. She talked about moving cities one day. She spoke about children, not as a deadline, not as a role, but as an idea she could choose or refuse on her own terms. I used to think wanting space meant I was selfish, she told me. Now I think it means I'm listening. I smiled. That understanding had taken me decades. Around that time, I received a call I hadn't expected. Evan's mother. Her voice was strained, polite in the way people are when they're holding back something heavier. She asked if we could talk. I hesitated, then agreed. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. She looked older than I remembered, the sharp edges of certainty softened by something like grief. After a few minutes of small talk, she sighed. I didn't want to believe it, she said. I still don't know what to believe. I nodded. That's understandable. She folded her hands tightly on the table. He says you exaggerated, that you turned a moment into a scandal. I met her eyes. He would say that. Her jaw tightened. He's my son. And she's my daughter, I replied gently. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she spoke again. I wish someone had stopped him earlier, she said. I wish I'd known what to look for. So did I. But wishing doesn't change the past. Only what we do next matters. I hope he gets help, I said honestly. But help only works when it's wanted. She nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. When we parted, there was no resolution, only an unspoken understanding. Love does not excuse harm, even when it aches to. I told Mara about the meeting later. She listened, then said, I don't hate them. I just don't want to carry their confusion anymore. You don't have to, I assured her. That boundary, clear, calm, unapologetic, became one of her strongest tools. As another year passed, the story of the wedding transformed yet again. It stopped being a wound and became a reference point, a reminder of what happens when intuition is ignored and what becomes possible when it's honored. Mara began mentoring a younger colleague at work who was struggling in her own relationship. She didn't tell her what to do. She didn't warn or accuse. She listened. She asked questions. She offered language where there once had only been unease. She didn't leave, Mara told me one night, but she said she started noticing things. That's how it begins, I said. Awareness before action. Watching my daughter become a safe place for others felt like a quiet redemption, not because pain should justify itself, but because healing, when shared, multiplies. For me, the ripple effects showed up in unexpected conversations. Friends confided stories they'd never told. Strangers reached out after hearing about what happened, thanking me for speaking up. I learned how many people were waiting for permission to name what they'd lived through. One message read, "I thought love was supposed to hurt a little. Your story helped me realize it shouldn't." I sat with that for a long time. How many lives are shaped by that one belief? On the anniversary of the day Mara moved into her apartment, we celebrated. Not with cake or ceremony, but with dinner and laughter. At one point, she raised her glass. "To choosing ourselves," she said. "To choosing truth," I added. She smiled. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "if you hadn't stood up that day, I think I would have married him anyway." The honesty of that statement took my breath away. "I know," I said quietly. "I don't blame you for being afraid," she continued, "but I'm grateful you weren't afraid enough to stay quiet." I reached across the table and held her hand. The weight of that moment settled gently, without regret. Gratitude had finally replaced guilt. As the night wound down, I walked home under a sky streaked with stars, thinking about how close we'd come to a different ending. One where my daughter learned to make herself smaller, one where my silence hardened into habit, one where laughter covered harm so well no one wanted to peel it back. That future exists somewhere, parallel and unseen. I don't dwell on it. I focus on the one we chose instead. People often ask if I'd do it again. Stand up, speak out, disrupt something beautiful to reveal something true. The answer lives in the way Mara carries herself now, in her steady gaze, in her unguarded laughter, in her refusal to be fixed. Yes, without hesitation. Because love that requires silence is not love, and a mother's voice raised in protection is not interference, it is inheritance. As the years continued to unfold, I began to understand something I hadn't before. Healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly in ordinary moments, disguised as normalcy. You don't wake up one day and feel whole. You wake up and realize you no longer feel fractured. Mara reached that place before I did. I could see it in how she moved through the world, with less vigilance, less self-questioning. She trusted her reactions now. If something made her uncomfortable, she didn't argue herself out of it. She listened. That alone changed everything. One afternoon, she invited me to attend a small workshop she was hosting at the community center. It wasn't advertised as anything dramatic, just a conversation about boundaries, self-worth, and recognizing unhealthy dynamics early. I sat in the back of the room, unnoticed, watching my daughter speak with clarity and compassion. She didn't share details about Evan. She didn't need to. She spoke about patterns instead, about how control often arrives dressed as care, about how love doesn't rush you or make you feel indebted, about how discomfort is information, not something to be swallowed. As I listened, my chest tightened with emotion. Not sorrow this time, but pride. This was the woman she had become because she had been allowed to choose herself, because someone had interrupted the story before it trapped her. Afterward, as we walked to the car, she said, "I was scared I'd freeze up." "But you didn't," I said. She smiled. "I realized something while I was talking. I wasn't trying to convince anyone. I was just telling the truth." That, I knew, was the difference between survival and freedom. My own journey took another unexpected turn when I started therapy myself, not because I was in crisis, but because I finally understood that strength didn't mean going it alone. Sitting across from someone who listened without judgment, I unpacked decades of minimized pain, of choices shaped by fear instead of desire. I spoke about my marriage, about the years of shrinking, about how easily I'd mistaken endurance for loyalty. Saying those things out loud felt like exhaling after holding my breath underwater for far too long. One session, my therapist asked, "What do you think you taught your daughter about love before the wedding?" The question stung. "That it requires patience," I said slowly, "that compromise matters, that relationships are work." "And after?" she asked. I thought of Mara standing tall, handing back a ring, choosing herself in front of a room full of people. "That love should never cost you your sense of self," I said. She nodded. "Both lessons matter, but the second one saves lives." Those words echoed in my mind long after I left her office. Mara and I talked more openly now about everything: relationships, fears, hopes. There was a tenderness in our conversations that hadn't existed before, not because we lacked love then, but because we'd both been afraid of breaking something fragile. Now we knew truth didn't destroy what was real, it revealed it. One evening, she asked me a question I hadn't anticipated. "Do you think Evan ever loved me?" I considered it carefully. "I think he loved the way you made him feel. I don't think he knew how to love without control." She nodded, accepting the nuance. "That makes sense." "What matters," I added, "is that you know what love feels like now." She smiled softly. "Safe," she said. That single word felt like a victory. Every once in a while, someone from the wedding would resurface, an old friend, a distant relative, bringing with them an awkward apology or an uncomfortable curiosity. Some admitted they'd laughed at the joke without thinking. Others confessed they'd felt uneasy but said nothing. "I wish I'd spoken up," one woman told me quietly at a reunion. "So do I replied gently, "but speaking up now still matters." Those conversations reminded me how collective silence sustains harm, how easily people rely on someone else to intervene, how rarely anyone wants to be the one who disrupts the celebration. Mara disrupted it anyway, with my help, and the world did not end. In fact, it opened. One crisp autumn morning, we walked through a farmer's market together, the air sharp with apples and cinnamon. Mara stopped at a stall selling handmade jewelry, shining a simple silver ring over in her fingers. "I like this one," she said, "not for what it means to anyone else, just because I do." She bought it and slid it on her hand without ceremony. I watched her, feeling something settle deep inside me. Later that day, she said, "I don't think I'll ever want a big wedding again." I laughed softly. "That's more than okay." "I think if I ever do get married," she continued, "it'll be quiet, intentional, and only if it adds to my life." I nodded. "Marriage should be an addition, not a correction." She smiled at that. "You should put that on a sign." As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street, I realized how far we'd come from that glittering hall filled with laughter and denial. The memory no longer hurt. It felt distant, almost instructive, like a story told to teach rather than wound. If I could speak to the woman I was then, the one smoothing her dress, convincing herself to relax, I would tell her this: trust the discomfort. It's trying to protect you. Don't wait for certainty. Harm rarely announces itself clearly. It whispers, it jokes, it hides behind applause. And if you are a mother listening to this, holding your tongue because you're afraid of losing your child, know this: silence doesn't preserve connection. Honesty does, even when it's messy, even when it costs you the illusion of peace. Because the truth is, that day did not destroy my daughter's life. It saved it, and it gave both of us something we never had before: a future built on truth instead of fear.
By the time the third year rolled around, The story of the wedding had become something people referenced in passing, not with shock anymore, but with understanding. It was no longer a scandal. It was a cautionary tale, a quiet marker of a boundary drawn in public when it would have been easier to keep it private. For Mara, that shift mattered. Being known for survival rather than spectacle allowed her to move forward without feeling defined by what she'd escaped. She became more than the woman who left at the altar. She became the woman who chose herself. I saw that transformation clearly the day she told me she'd been offered a leadership role at work. I almost said no, she admitted, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. My first instinct was that I wasn't ready. And then, I asked. And then I asked myself whose voice that really was, she said. It wasn't mine. She took the job. Watching her step into authority, calm, thoughtful, confident, felt like watching a language she'd always known finally spoken aloud. She set boundaries without apology. She delegated without guilt. She listened without absorbing responsibility for everyone else's emotions. She told me once, I used to think leadership meant being liked. Now I think it means being honest. I smiled. You're learning faster than I did. Around that time, she started dating again, not in the tentative, cautious way of early healing, but with curiosity and self-trust. She told me about Daniel, a man she met through mutual friends. He was kind, unassuming, comfortable with silence. He asked questions and waited for answers. He didn't rush intimacy or demand reassurance. I don't feel like I'm auditioning, she said. I just feel like myself. I was careful not to project my hopes onto her. Healing doesn't guarantee outcomes. It changes how we meet them. Still, when I saw how she laughed around him, open, unguarded, I allowed myself to feel quietly optimistic. They took things slowly. When she introduced him to me, it wasn't with nerves, but with ease. He shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and thanked me for raising such a thoughtful daughter. No grand gestures, no charm offensive, just respect. Afterward, Mara asked, So, I said, I didn't feel the need to warn you. She laughed. That's the highest compliment. As her life expanded, so did mine. I found myself less consumed by worry, more open to possibility. I took a class I'd always wanted to take. I traveled alone for the first time in years. I learned how to enjoy my own company without filling the space with responsibility. I also found myself speaking more openly in public settings, panels, discussions, informal gatherings about what had happened, not to relive it, but to normalize the conversation. Abuse thrives on isolation. Stories break that isolation. At one event, a young woman approached me afterward, eyes shining with unshed tears. She said quietly, My mom laughed when my boyfriend said something like that. She told me not to be so sensitive. My heart clenched. What did it make you feel? I asked. Small, she said. That feeling matters more than anyone else's comfort. She nodded, as if receiving permission she'd been waiting for. Moments like that reminded me why telling the truth mattered long after the moment passed, why one act of courage can ripple outward in ways we'll never fully see. Mara and Daniel's relationship deepened, not through intensity, but through consistency. They disagreed without fear. They made space for each other's lives. When Mara told him about Evan, not in detail, just enough, he listened without defensiveness or curiosity masked as concern. Thank you for trusting me with that, he said. That was all. One evening, as we sat on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker on, Mara said something that surprised me. I used to think you embarrassed me that day. I waited, heart steady. But now, she continued, I think you modeled something for me, what it looks like to love someone more than you love appearances. I reached for her hand. I wish I'd done it sooner. She squeezed my fingers. You did it when it mattered. As the seasons turned, the memory of the wedding softened even more. It no longer felt like a fracture point. It felt like a doorway, one that had led us both somewhere truer. Mara eventually moved in with Daniel, not as a leap of faith, but as a thoughtful step. She kept her own bank account, her own hobbies, her own space. I don't want to disappear again, she told me. You won't, I said with certainty. I noticed something else, too. She no longer sought my approval the way she once had. She didn't need permission. She wanted connection. That shift told me everything. One afternoon, she asked me to walk with her through a bridal boutique, not to buy anything, just to look, to reclaim the space without fear. I hesitated, then agreed. We walked among the racks quietly. She touched fabrics, smiled at silhouettes, moved on. No grief, no tension, just curiosity. I don't feel sad, she said. I feel neutral. That's healing, I replied. She nodded. I don't need the dress to mean anything anymore. As we left, sunlight streaming through the windows, I realized how completely the narrative had changed. The thing that once threatened to define her no longer held power. She had rewritten it. That night, I sat alone with a cup of tea, thinking about the moment Evan had laughed and said he'd fix her flaws. How close that moment had come to disappearing into the noise. How easily I could have smiled and clapped and gone home. Instead, I chose disruption. And disruption, I learned, can be an act of love. If you are listening to this and standing at your own threshold, wondering whether to speak, whether to trust your instincts, know this. Truth rarely arrives at convenient times, but when it does arrive, it asks for courage, not perfection. And when you answer it, even trembling, it will carry you further than silence ever could. By the 4th year, the memory of that wedding felt less like a wound and more like a marker on a long road, something you pass, glance at, and keep moving. It still mattered, it always would, but it no longer dictated our steps. Instead, it informed them. Mara and Daniel settled into a rhythm that felt steady rather than spectacular. They argued about mundane things, whose turn it was to cook, where to spend holidays, but the arguments never spiraled into accusations or power plays. When tension arose, it was addressed instead of buried. Watching that taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. Healthy love doesn't erase conflict. It makes room for it, without fear. One afternoon, Mara called me after a disagreement. We didn't fix it right away, she said, sounding unsettled. We just paused. That's not failure, I told her. That's regulation. She laughed softly. I'm still learning the language. So am I admitted. I noticed how differently she carried herself in public now. She no longer scanned rooms for approval. She spoke up when interrupted. She trusted her instincts enough to act on them. These were not grand transformations, just quiet ones, and they mattered more. One evening, Mara proposed, not with a crowd or a spectacle, but with a simple question over dinner at home. Mara told me about it afterwards, smiling but thoughtful. I said yes, she said, but I also said we'd take our time. And how did he respond? I asked. He said he wouldn't want it any other way. That was all I needed to hear. When she shared the news publicly, there was no rush to plan, no urgency to prove anything. She didn't frame it as redemption or closure. It was just another step, chosen freely. Watching her approach commitment without fear or urgency felt like the final proof that the cycle had been broken. As plans slowly took shape, she asked me something I hadn't expected. Would you be willing to speak again, she said, at the wedding, if we have one? I felt my breath catch. Only if you want me to. She said, I do, But this time I want it to be about what love is, not what it isn't. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. I'd be honored. Planning this second wedding felt entirely different. There was no tension humming beneath the surface, no forced smiles, no compromises made out of fear. Mara chose everything deliberately: venue, guest list, timing. She invited people who had supported her without question. She didn't invite Evan's family. There was no drama in that decision, just clarity. One evening, as we reviewed seating options, she paused. "Do you ever think about him anymore?" she asked. "I sometimes," I admitted, not with anger, more with curiosity. "Me too," she said. "I wonder if he ever realizes what he lost." I considered that. I hope he realizes what he needs to change, but that's his work, not yours. She nodded. I know. The day of the second wedding arrived quietly, without spectacle. A small outdoor ceremony, natural light, no elaborate decor, just people gathered with intention. Mara wore a simple dress that moved easily when she walked. She looked calm, present, free. As I watched her stand beside Daniel, I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't known was still restless. Not relief, completion. When it was my turn to speak, I stood with steady hands and an open heart. I spoke about listening, about choosing growth over comfort, about love that doesn't seek to improve someone, but to know them. I didn't mention the past directly. I didn't need to. The truth was woven into who we had become. Afterwards, Mara hugged me tightly. "This feels right," she whispered. "It is," I said. As the evening wound down, laughter filled the space, not the nervous laughter of denial, but the easy kind that comes from safety. I looked around at the faces gathered there and thought about how different this was from that first celebration. Not louder, not grander, just truer. Later, alone at home, I reflected on the arc of it all, how one sentence, said casually, laughed at easily, had nearly set a life on a path of quiet harm, how courage, once summoned, had continued to echo years later in choices made freely. I thought about the women who had written to me, the mothers who had thanked me, the daughters who had listened. I understood then that stories don't end when the crisis passes. They keep working on us, shaping how we respond to the next moment that asks for courage. If there is one final lesson I carry with me, it's this. Love is not proven by endurance. It's proven by respect, by safety, by the freedom to be fully oneself without fear of correction. That first wedding ended in silence and shock. The second ended in laughter and peace. Between them lay years of truth, grief, healing, and growth. I wouldn't erase any of it, because the day I stood up and spoke, I didn't just save my daughter from a life of being fixed. I helped her build a life where nothing about her needed fixing at all. And in doing so, I finally learned the same lesson for myself. After the second wedding, life didn't slow down the way people expected to. There was no neat ending, no sense that the work was finished. Healing, I learned, doesn't conclude with a ceremony. It settles into your bones and asks to be lived out, day by ordinary day. Mara moved forward with a confidence that no longer felt borrowed. She and Daniel built a life that looked simple from the outside and intentional from the inside. They made choices slowly. They talked things through. They treated rest as necessary, not indulgent. Watching them taught me that love doesn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. It needs to be steady. For me, something else began to happen. People started asking me to speak, not formally at first, just small groups, community rooms, living rooms, mothers who leaned forward in their chairs and daughters who sat with arms folded tightly as if bracing themselves. I didn't set out to become a voice for anything. I simply told the truth when asked. I told them about the wedding, about the joke that wasn't a joke, about the silence that almost cost my daughter her future. I told them how fear can disguise itself as loyalty, how love can be misnamed so convincingly we stop questioning it. And every time I spoke, someone would nod, someone would cry, someone would stay after to say, "That happened to me," or "I wish my mother had done that," or "I don't know how to speak up." Those moments humbled me. They reminded me that stories don't belong to us once we tell them. They become mirrors and sometimes lifelines. One night, after a long conversation with a group of women, I came home exhausted and full at the same time. Mara was there, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up and smiled. "How was it?" she asked. "Hard," I said, "and necessary." She nodded. "That's how it feels for me, too." We sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand filling. I realized then how rare that had once been for both of us, how often silence had felt loaded, tense, expectant. Now it simply was. As the years passed, I noticed how differently Mara handled conflict, not just in her marriage, but everywhere, at work, with friends, with family. She didn't appease, she didn't disappear, she didn't brace herself for fallout that never came. When she spoke, it was with clarity, not apology. One afternoon, she told me about a younger colleague who had confided in her about a boyfriend who constantly criticized her under the guise of humor. "He says he's just trying to help me be better," the woman had said. Mara told her what she'd learned. "If someone loves you," she said gently, "they don't see you as a project." When she told me that story, I felt a quiet ache behind my eyes, not sadness, recognition. The cycle had not just been broken, it had been redirected. My own life shifted in quieter ways. I reconnected with parts of myself I'd neglected: creativity, curiosity, rest. I stopped defining myself solely by my roles: mother, protector, survivor. I allowed myself to simply be a woman who had lived, learned, and chosen differently when it mattered most. One evening, I ran into someone from the first wedding, a distant relative who had laughed loudest at Evan's joke. She looked uncomfortable when she recognized me. "I think about that day a lot," she said, shifting her weight. "I didn't understand what was happening. I just followed the crowd." "So did most people," I replied. "I wish I'd done something," she said. I met her eyes. "You can still do something, just not for us, for the next time." She nodded, tears gathering. We hugged briefly, and I walked away feeling lighter. Accountability doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like awareness arriving late but sincere. Mara and Daniel eventually talked about children, not with urgency, not with expectation, with curiosity. "If we do this," Mara said once, "I want them to grow up knowing love doesn't hurt." "They will," I said without hesitation, "because you know that now." She smiled. "Because you taught me." The weight of those words settled gently, not as guilt or pride, but as gratitude. I hadn't been perfect. I hadn't been brave from the start, but I had been brave when it mattered. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that moment when Evan said he'd fix her flaws. How easily it could have slipped by. How laughter almost swallowed it whole. I think about how many times that still happens in rooms full of people, in relationships cloaked in normalcy. I hope that someone listening to this hears my story and recognizes themselves sooner than I did. I hope they learn that discomfort is not something to dismiss, that jokes can be warnings, that silence is a choice and not always a neutral one. If I could speak to every mother, every parent, every person standing on the edge of a truth that feels too disruptive to voice, I would say this: love is not fragile, lies are. Truth might crack the surface, but what's real will survive it. Mara once asked me if I ever wished I could go back and change the years before the wedding. I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said, "because then I might forget what silence costs." She nodded, understanding fully. Now, when I look at my daughter, I don't see someone who was saved. I see someone who reclaimed herself. I see a woman who knows her worth, who trusts her voice, who refuses to be fixed because she was never broken. And when I look at myself, I see something new too. Not just a mother who spoke up, but a woman who finally listened to her instincts, her fears, and her truth. That day at the wedding changed everything, not because it destroyed a celebration, but because it ended a lie. And in its place, it gave us a life built on honesty, courage, and love that does not ask us to disappear. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as endings, but you feel the quiet finality of them all the same. For me, it came on an ordinary morning, years after everything had settled, when Mara called just to say hello. Not because she needed advice, not because something was wrong, just because she wanted to share a small, happy detail about her day. "I'm making bread," she said, laughing at herself. "I never thought I'd be this person." I smiled into the phone. The sound of her voice was relaxed, unguarded. There was no tightness in it, no need for approval. When we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, holding the silence like something precious. That was when I understood. This was the ending. Not a dramatic one, a peaceful one. People often think the most important part of a story is the confrontation, the moment when truth explodes into the open. But that isn't where the real change lives. The real change lives in what comes after, in the ordinary days that prove the truth was worth telling. Mara's life became beautifully unremarkable. She worked, she rested, she laughed easily. She didn't shrink herself to fit anyone else's expectations. When she made mistakes, she owned them without shame. When she succeeded, she didn't minimize it. Watching her live that way healed parts of me I hadn't known were still tender. And I changed too. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I stopped apologizing for my boundaries. I stopped believing that peace required my silence. I learned that being calm doesn't mean being passive, and being kind doesn't mean being quiet. Every once in a while, someone would still bring up the first wedding, usually in a hushed tone, as if afraid to disturb an old ghost. They'd ask if I regretted what I did. I never did. What I regretted was how close I came to not doing it. I regretted the nights I lay awake convincing myself that it wasn't my place, that love meant enduring discomfort, that silence was safer than truth. I regretted the way fear almost dressed itself up as wisdom. But regret, when faced honestly, becomes instruction. It teaches you where not to turn away next time. I thought often about Evan, though not in the way people might expect. I don't wonder if he's happy. I wonder if he's learned. I wonder if anyone ever challenged him again, or if he found someone else willing to mistake control for care. But those questions no longer carry weight for me. His story stopped intersecting with ours the day we chose honesty. What stayed with me instead were the letters, the messages from women who said they recognized themselves in Mara, from mothers who said they'd been waiting for permission to speak up, from daughters who said they felt seen for the first time. I never responded with advice. I responded with truth, with reminders that love should not require erasure, that respect is not negotiable, that fear is information, not weakness. One message in particular has never left me. It was from a young woman who wrote, "My fiancé says he'll help me fix the parts of me that make life harder. I thought that was love. Now I'm not so sure." I wrote back simply, "If someone loves you, they don't see you as broken." That sentence had once saved my daughter. Now it belonged to someone else. Mara and Daniel eventually welcomed a child into their lives, a quiet miracle they approached with the same intention they'd given everything. When I first held my grandchild, I felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly buckled my knees. Not fear, not protectiveness, hope. I looked at that small, perfect face and thought about the legacy we passed down without meaning to, the lessons taught in tone, in silence, in what we allow and what we challenge. I promised myself then that this child would grow up knowing their voice mattered, that love never asked them to disappear. One afternoon, as Mara and I watched the baby nap, she turned to me and said, "I hope I can be the kind of mother you were that day." I met her gaze. "You already are," I said, "because you're willing to speak." She reached for my hand. We didn't need to say more. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it comes trembling, unsure, asking only that you move despite your fear. That day at the wedding, I wasn't fearless. I was simply unwilling to be silent any longer. And that made all the difference. If you're listening to this and standing at the edge of your own truth, wondering if speaking it will cost too much, I want you to know this. The cost of silence is often paid in pieces of yourself, in years lost, in quiet suffering that no one applauds you for enduring. Truth may disrupt, it may disappoint, it may even destroy what was built on lies, but it also clears space for something real to grow. My daughter once stood at an altar beside a man who believed love meant fixing her flaws. Today, she stands in her life whole, respected, and free. Not because she was rescued, but because someone reminded her she never needed to be fixed. That is the lesson I carry forward. That is the story I leave behind. And if it reaches even one person in time, then every uncomfortable moment, every fractured relationship, every uneasy silence that followed was worth it. Because love, real love, does not demand your silence. It listens, it honors, and it lets you remain yourself. Time has a way of softening the sharpest memories, not by erasing them, but by placing them in perspective. Years after everything that happened, the story of that first wedding no longer lives at the center of my days. It rests on the shelf of my life like a well-worn book, one I don't need to open often, but one I'm glad I read all the way through. My days now are quiet in the best possible way. Mornings begin with light through the kitchen window and the sound of coffee brewing. Sometimes Mara calls early, her voice warm and unhurried, telling me about something small that made her laugh or something thoughtful Daniel said the night before. Sometimes my grandchild babbles in the background, and I close my eyes just to listen, committing the sound to memory. There is no tension in those calls, no second guessing, no careful wording. Love no longer feels like something we have to tiptoe around. Occasionally, I'll be asked to retell the story, usually by someone who's heard it secondhand and wants to understand how a single moment could change so much. They expect drama. They expect anger. What they don't expect is how calm it feels now to tell it. I explain that the power of that moment didn't come from the shock. It came from the clarity, from recognizing something that had always been there and choosing, finally, not to look away. I tell them that the most dangerous relationships don't announce themselves with cruelty. They arrive wrapped in charm, in jokes, in promises of improvement. They convince you that discomfort is love's entry fee, that being corrected is the same as being cared for. And I tell them how easy it is to believe that until someone you love starts to disappear. There was a time when I thought being a good mother meant trusting my child's choices without question. I know now that trust and silence are not the same thing. Trust means believing in your child's strength, not abandoning them to their doubts. It means speaking up, not to control, but to illuminate. Mara once told me that the hardest part wasn't leaving Evan, it was admitting to herself how much she'd been shrinking to keep the peace. She said, "I didn't even realize I was doing it. It felt normal." That word normal lingers with me. How many harmful things wear that disguise? How many people endure quiet suffering because it's familiar, because it's been normalized by laughter, by tradition, by other people's comfort? I've learned that discomfort is often the body's way of asking for attention, that intuition whispers long before harm shouts, and that ignoring those whispers doesn't make them go away. It only makes them louder later. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed seated that day, if I'd smiled politely and clapped along, if I'd told myself it wasn't my place. The thought still sends a chill through me, not because of what might have happened to Mara, though that matters most, but because of who I would have become. Silence changes us. It teaches us to doubt ourselves. It erodes our sense of agency. It makes us complicit in ways we don't recognize until it's too late. Speaking up changed me. It restored something I hadn't realized I'd lost, trust in my own voice. Now, when I encounter moments that feel wrong, I don't rush past them. I pause. I listen. I ask questions. And if needed, I speak, even when my voice shakes. That doesn't mean every truth lands well. It doesn't mean every conversation ends neatly. But it does mean I no longer carry the weight of unspoken regret. Mara lives that way too. I see it in how she parents, how she partners, how she navigates the world. She doesn't demand perfection from herself or others. She demands respect, and that makes all the difference. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, she said something that stays with me still. I used to think love meant changing to fit someone else's idea of me. Now I know it means being seen and still chosen. I reached for her hand, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in my chest. If this story has taught me anything, it's that love is not a project. People are not problems to be solved. And the moment someone frames you as something that needs fixing, something sacred has already been crossed. I don't tell this story to shock. I tell it to remind mothers to trust their instincts, to remind daughters to trust their discomfort, to remind everyone that real love doesn't come with conditions disguised as care. The day I stood up at my daughter's wedding, I thought I was destroying something. In reality, I was clearing the ground. What grew afterwards, truth, safety, freedom, was worth every broken illusion. If you're listening and something in this story feels uncomfortably familiar, don't ignore that feeling. Sit with it, question it, share it with someone who listens without judgment. Your voice matters more than you've been taught to believe. This is where my story ends, not with applause or outrage, but with peace, with a daughter who knows her worth, with a family built on honesty, with a life that no longer requires silence to survive. And that, to me, is the truest happy ending there is. I used to think endings had to feel final to matter, that there would be a moment where the lesson crystallized and nothing more would be required of me. But the longer I live with this story, the more I understand that its ending isn't a full stop. It's a way of moving through the world. Years have passed now, enough that new memories have layered themselves over the old ones. The sound of that first wedding, glasses clinking, laughter rising too easily, has faded. In its place are quieter sounds, my grandchild's breath as they sleep against my shoulder, the low murmur of conversation at family dinners where no one is performing, the soft confidence in Mara's voice when she talks about her life. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I revisit the woman I was before all of this happened, the woman who noticed discomfort and told herself it was none of her business, the woman who believed that staying quiet was the same as staying kind. I don't judge her harshly anymore. She was doing the best she knew how with the tools she had. But I don't want to be her again. Because once you understand what silence can cost, you can't unknow it. I've learned to recognize the early signs now, the jokes that land just a little too sharply, the compliments that come with conditions, the way someone's confidence dims slowly, so slowly you almost miss it. I don't ignore those things anymore. I don't laugh them off. I don't assume someone else will speak up. I speak. Not always loudly, not always publicly. Sometimes it's a quiet question. Sometimes it's a hand on an arm and a gentle, "Are you okay?" Sometimes it's a firm boundary, but it's always honest. And something remarkable happens when you live that way. You give others permission to do the same. I've seen it in friends who now ask for what they need without apology, in relatives who no longer tolerate being belittled for the sake of harmony, in young women who hear this story and recognize their own unease as something worth paying attention to, not something to suppress. Mara once told me that the hardest part of healing wasn't letting go of Evan, it was learning to trust herself again. "He made me doubt my reactions," she said, "like I was always overreacting." That's what control does best. It convinces you that your instincts are unreliable, that your feelings are flaws, that your discomfort is a personal failing instead of a warning. Watching Mara reclaim her trust in herself has been one of the great privileges of my life. Watching her raise a child with that same trust, teaching them that their feelings matter, that their voice is welcome, feels like witnessing the future correct itself. Every once in a while, someone will ask me if I'm proud of what I did that day. I don't answer right away. Pride isn't the word I reach for. Pride suggests ego, achievement, a moment polished and put on display. What I feel is quieter than that. It's alignment, the sense that my actions finally matched my values, that when the moment asked who I was, I answered honestly. I am proud of Mara, though, proud of her courage, her growth, her refusal to confuse love with endurance, proud of the life she's built with intention instead of fear, proud of the way she speaks up now, not with anger, but with certainty. And I'm proud of the woman I've become in her reflection. There is a strange comfort in knowing that the story doesn't belong to me anymore. It lives in other people now, reshaped by their own experiences. It surfaces when someone decides not to laugh at a cruel joke, when someone asks a hard question instead of staying silent, when someone walks away from a relationship that demands they be smaller. That's how stories change the world, not all at once, but moment by moment, choice by choice. If I could offer one last thing to anyone listening, it would be this. Pay attention to the language people use when they claim to love you. Love does not correct your personality. It does not keep score of your shortcomings. It does not frame you as a problem to be solved. Love listens. Love protects. Love leaves you more yourself, not less. The day my daughter's fiancé said he would fix her flaws, something in me finally broke open, not in anger, but in clarity. I saw the path ahead with painful sharpness, and I chose not to let her walk it alone. That choice changed everything, not because it was dramatic, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. And truth, once spoken, has a way of continuing long after the moment is past, shaping lives, strengthening voices, and reminding us all that we are not here to be fixed. We are here to be seen. As time stretched on, I noticed something subtle but profound. The story no longer lived in my chest as tension, it lived there as wisdom. What once felt like a burden I carried now felt like a compass I trusted. I didn't relive the pain. I remembered the direction it pointed me toward. Life continued, not without difficulty, but without the kind of fear that shrinks you from the inside. There were still disagreements in the family, still moments of misunderstanding, still days when emotions ran high, but none of it carried the old weight of walking on eggshells. We spoke plainly now. We apologized when we were wrong. We repaired instead of pretending nothing had happened. Mara became especially good at repair. I watched her navigate conflict with a steadiness that once seemed impossible for her. She no longer explained herself endlessly, hoping someone would finally understand. She said what she meant, trusted that it was enough, and allowed others to respond however they chose. That alone was freedom. One afternoon, she came over with my grandchild bundled against her chest, eyes tired but bright. We sat at the kitchen table while the baby slept, the afternoon light pooling gently around us. "Do you ever think," she said slowly, "about how close everything came to going a different way?" "All the time," I admitted. She nodded. "Sometimes it scares me, and sometimes it makes me feel incredibly grateful." That's a healthy response. Fear reminds us what matters. Gratitude reminds us what's possible. She smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes from being fully present. "I don't want to forget, but I don't want to live there either." "You don't have to," I told her. "You carry the lesson without carrying the pain." That's the balance we both learned. Not erasing the past, but not being ruled by it. Letting memory inform, not imprison. Over the years, people continued to reach out, sometimes strangers, sometimes acquaintances who had quietly watched everything unfold. They would ask how I knew it was time to speak, how I found the courage, how I lived with the fallout. I told them the truth. I didn't know for certain. I wasn't brave by nature. I simply reached a point where staying silent felt more dangerous than speaking. Courage, I learned, is often just clarity meeting necessity. I also learned that fallout is rarely as catastrophic as we imagine. Yes, there were strained relationships. Yes, there were people who never fully forgave me, but the ones who mattered stayed. And the peace that followed was worth far more than the approval I lost. The most surprising part was how much gentler I became with myself afterward. I stopped replaying old mistakes with cruelty. I stopped asking why I hadn't acted sooner. Instead, I asked what I could do now. That shift changed everything. One evening, as I rocked my grandchild to sleep, I thought about the kind of world I wanted them to grow into. A world where love wasn't conditional, where mistakes weren't weaponized, where people weren't praised for endurance at the expense of their well-being. I hummed softly, feeling the weight of generations settle and then lift. Patterns can be broken. Stories can change. Not perfectly, not instantly, but deliberately. Mara once told me she no longer fears love. She fears silence. That stayed with me. Silence, I now understand, is not neutral. It either protects what is harmful or it challenges it. It either preserves comfort or makes room for truth. We choose its role every time we decide whether to speak. I don't see myself as a hero in this story. I see myself as someone who finally listened to my instincts, to my love for my daughter, to the quiet insistence that something wasn't right. That listening changed the course of our lives. If you're listening to this and wondering whether your voice matters, let me say this clearly. It does, even if it shakes, even if it disrupts, even if it comes later than you wish it had. Especially then. Because the moment you speak, you teach someone else that they can too. This story began with a joke at a wedding, one that revealed a truth hidden in plain sight. It ends here in a life built on awareness, honesty, and respect. Not flawless, not untouched, but real. And real, I've learned, is far better than perfect. By the time I reached this stage of my life, I no longer measured growth by milestones. I measured it by how quickly I noticed when something felt wrong and how little time I spent talking myself out of that knowing. That, to me, became the quiet reward of everything we had lived through. There was a season, not long ago, when I attended another wedding, not in our family, but close enough that the memories stirred anyway. I sat near the back, hands folded in my lap, listening to speeches with a different kind of attention than I once had. Not suspicion, awareness. The groom spoke about how lucky he was to have found someone who challenged him, who called him out, who stood firmly in who she was. He never once framed her as something to improve. When people laughed, it was because they recognized themselves in the joy, not because something sharp had slipped by unnoticed. I realized then that the room felt different. People were listening, truly listening, as if somewhere along the way we had all learned something. I don't take credit for that. Change never belongs to one person. But I do believe it spreads quietly, carried in the way we respond when we recognize harm instead of excusing it. After the ceremony, a woman I barely knew approached me. She hesitated before speaking, as if weighing whether to say anything at all. "I heard your story," she said softly, "about your daughter." I nodded, waiting. "It helped me leave," she said. "I just wanted you to know." There was no dramatic exchange after that, no long explanation. She didn't need to justify herself. She didn't need validation. Her words were enough. I thanked her, but what I felt was something deeper than gratitude. It was confirmation, not that I had done something extraordinary, but that truth, once spoken, keeps moving long after we think the story is over. Mara continues to live her life with the kind of grounded confidence that once felt unimaginable. She doesn't perform happiness. She doesn't defend her choices. She trusts herself, and that trust shows up in everything she does. Sometimes we talk about the past openly now, without heaviness, not as something that defines her, but as something that shaped her discernment. She no longer asks how she missed the signs. She asks how she learned to see them. That difference matters. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, she paused and said, "You know, I used to think love meant effort, constant effort. And now," I asked, "now I think love feels like room," she said. "Room to breathe, room to be wrong, room to grow without being corrected." I smiled to myself. That understanding alone was worth everything. I've also noticed how differently people speak to me now, not with fear or caution, but with respect. They know I won't laugh off something harmful. They know I won't protect comfort at the expense of truth. That doesn't make me popular in every room, but it makes me trustworthy in the ones that matter. There was a time when I feared losing relationships if I spoke up. What I lost instead were illusions, and what remained were connections built on honesty rather than politeness. As I grow older, I think often about legacy, not the kind written down, but the kind lived out, the patterns we interrupt, the conversations we change, the silences we refuse to carry forward. I think about my own mother and how much she endured quietly because she believed that was love. I don't blame her. She lived in a world that rewarded silence and called it strength. But I also know that by speaking when I did, I shifted something not just for Mara, but backward and forward through generations. That matters to me more than being seen as brave. If I could speak to the woman I was sitting in that wedding audience years ago, heart racing, doubt pressing in, I would tell her this: you don't need certainty to speak. You only need honesty. The rest will unfold. Because once you choose truth, life rearranges itself around it. It may take time, it may feel messy, but clarity has a way of building something steadier than fear ever could. This story was never really about a wedding, or a speech, or even a secret. It was about learning to recognize control when it disguises itself as love and choosing not to pass that lesson on quietly. It was about understanding that love does not require fixing, enduring, or disappearing. It requires presence, respect, choice. And most of all, it was about learning that silence is not the price of peace. Peace comes from alignment, from living in a way that allows you to look at the people you love and yourself without regret. That is where I live now, and that is where this story finally rests. As the years gathered behind me, I began to notice how memory changes shape. It no longer arrived as sharp scenes or exact words, but as feelings, textures almost, the weight of a room, the sound of laughter that doesn't quite reach the eyes, the relief that comes when truth finally has somewhere to land. I realized that the story I'd been telling was no longer only mine to carry. It had become something I could set down without fear of it being lost. My grandchild grew older, curious and observant in a way that made me smile. Children notice more than we think. One afternoon, while we sat together drawing at the table, they looked up at me and asked, "Why do people sometimes say mean things and call it joking?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it came so early. I took a breath. "Sometimes people don't know how to be kind without feeling powerful," I said carefully. "And sometimes they don't realize the difference." They considered this, then nodded as if filing it away for later. That was all. No drama, no fear, just understanding beginning to form. In that moment, I felt something close to awe. This was how change really happened, not in grand confrontations, but in small, honest answers given before harm had time to root itself. Mara watched from across the room, her expression soft. Later, she said, "I'm glad they'll grow up hearing that." "So am I," I replied. There was a time when I worried my choice at the wedding would always define me, that people would only see the disruption, not the intention. But time has a way of clarifying motives. Those who stayed in our lives came to understand that what I did wasn't about control or spectacle. It was about love, refusing to be quiet. I've learned that some people will always prefer silence because it allows them not to choose. I no longer try to convince them otherwise. Everyone has their own moment when truth becomes unavoidable. You can't force it. You can only model what it looks like when you answer it honestly. That's what I try to do now, in conversations, in relationships, in the way I treat myself. Yes, myself. For a long time, I was hardest on me. I replayed the years before the wedding with an almost cruel precision, cataloging every moment I didn't speak up. But eventually, I understood that self-blame was just another form of silence, another way of avoiding the present. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about excusing harm. It's about releasing yourself from the belief that you must keep paying for it. When I finally forgave myself, something loosened. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I trusted my instincts without interrogating them. That shift mattered. I see it mirrored in Mara. She doesn't flinch anymore when someone disagrees with her. She doesn't rush to smooth things over. She allows tension to exist without seeing it as danger. That skill alone has changed her new life. We talk about it sometimes, how we both mistook peace for quiet once, and how different peace feels now. Peace has weight to it, substance. It doesn't disappear the moment someone speaks honestly. One evening, after my grandchild had gone to bed, Mara and I sat on the porch listening to the night sounds. She leaned her head against my shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was young. "I'm glad you spoke," she said softly. "So am I replied. There was no need to revisit the details. The moment had passed, and its purpose had been fulfilled. If this story has lingered with you, if it stirred something uncomfortable or familiar, I hope you hear this part clearly. You don't need a dramatic stage to choose truth. You don't need perfect words. You don't need permission. You only need to trust that love should never cost you your voice. I once stood in a room full of people and chose to speak when it would have been easier to stay seated. That choice rippled outward in ways I couldn't have imagined, into my daughter's life, my own, and now into a future that feels safer because of it. That is the power of one moment of honesty. And that is where I leave this story, not as a warning, but as an invitation to listen closely, to question gently, to speak when silence asks too much, because none of us are here to be fixed. We are here to be whole.